So I'm going to take this video from the standpoint that Matt Walsh is right in the sense of what he had said in regards to Pearl Davis, that the left is anti-marriage, and now they're seeing the right being anti-marriage. And that's the point. And of course, he's saying it for the purpose of, well, we need families, we need children, we need population. This is why they're going the route of importing all of these migrants into the country. And you need families to have a sustainable country. But the people who are in charge need consumption. This is a topic that should be talked about. America is a consumer economy. As a result of America being a consumer economy, it needs people to consume. And so when a woman is married to a man, that man curtails her spending because he typically, for the most part, traditional marriage was that the woman stayed at home, she raised the kids, she tended to the house, etc. She basically managed everything at the home, and the man managed everything outside of the home, and that the children basically were inculcated with the teaching of both of the parents. What we have today is we don't have that. We have both parents working, and then you have the state inculcating their teaching and their ideology into your children. And so what Matt Walsh says is true when he says that we need marriage. That marriage is very important, and that people who are quote unquote on the right are being pulled over to the left. They're being pulled over to leftist ideology. Now, of course, a lot of this started a very long time ago, talking well over 100 years ago, with introducing of feminism and introducing of birth control, and a lot of that revolves around eugenics. So if you look at the study of birth control in the early 1900s, it heavily revolved around eugenics, and that there were too many immigrants. Overwhelmingly, it was related to there being too many blacks, and of course, they deemed it from the standpoint of if your IQ was low, if you were born blind, if you had some sort of something that you were born with that was deficient, or if you were literally of the wrong skin color, and because you lacked education, well, you weren't fit to reproduce, what they referred to as dumb people. And so a lot of that impacted how America grew because they didn't want minorities, and the way that they did that was through birth control and propaganda. And of course, that's when you had the women's rights movements. A lot of it revolves heavily around depopulation and eugenics. And so from the standpoint of what Matt Walsh is talking about, where we do need marriages, we do need families, we do need, which will bring stability into the nation, the problem is that the people who are in charge, right? I forget who was the person, I think it's Rothschild, that said, I care not who makes the laws, I only care that I control the currency. Because if you control the currency, you control the people. If you control the food, and if you control the currency, doesn't matter what the laws are. You control the country. You can control the country. And if you can control the food source, whether you can control the people. And I believe it was the same person that said both. And this is the problem. The problem is looking at things through one lens. If we just do this one solution will fix many of the problems that we have. And the reality is that is not the case. Because the biggest problem we have is the state. The state is so big that it's incentivized to break people apart, especially when you need people to consume. And so we're going to propagandize the women. You don't need men. We're strong and independent. And at the end of the day, you got the state to back you up. They'll tax the men. They'll steal from the men, whatever they need to do to make the woman whole. And this is why you see men walking away. Years back, men were like, we're not going to get married, but they would live together. And so they lived together for a very long time. And then, of course, the state caught on to what men were doing. And so they said, they came out with common law that if you were with this woman and you were living with her, then she was your wife de facto if you lived with her for X amount of years. And so the state caught on to how men were adapting. And so now, of course, it comes to the point where men are just like, just walking away entirely. And the state will find a way to get their pound of flesh because they need to extract wealth from men because most women don't produce wealth. Most women and children are a net loss when it comes to any country. It's only until those individuals, those kids grow up and hopefully they produce. This is why China focused so heavily on the one child policy and making sure that that one child was a man. And that's what helped China grow from an impoverished nation to the biggest producer in the whole world. But of course, now they have an issue where they don't have enough women. And of course, that could be solved with just immigrating women, just pulling in women from another country so that the men have someone to marry. But at the end of the day, China may not want to go that route because maybe they want their men to focus. And so, because it creates competition, because the scarcity of women creates competition in the men. And so, the men by nature are forced to excel because China needs them to produce. America does not need their men to produce. What they need is they need people to consume. And so they go the route that they've gone. And this is the problem. And it revolves around either we're going to have a specific standard of living and we're going to maintain that specific standard of living based off of what we create and what we produce. If we don't, well, then we have to import. And if you have to import, you have to figure a way of how do you bring in new money. And of course, the way that America does that is through debt creation. And so we need to send those dollars abroad so that people want the dollar. If America can't meet the desire of other nations to be able to trade by Americans buying their product and then trading and then holding on to those dollars and then going to another country and say, well, we want to buy oil, we want to buy soybean, we want corn, etc. Then they'll do something else and all that inflation will come back. Because if the people in other countries don't need the dollar, then why am I going to hoard it? This is what they're doing, right? They're hodling. In essence, the way the dollar is working is that other countries are hodling the dollar until they need it because they don't need it within their country. They have their own currency within their own country that they trade with within their own country. They need it for trading in between countries. And so if less countries need the dollar, well, then that's less things that Americans can buy overseas because America doesn't produce enough for the standard of living that it has. And so this whole dynamic has to be taken into consideration of why the relationships are the way they are. How is it that the American government is able to print all of this money and create welfare and welfare jobs? Most of the women who work in government, most of the jobs are run by women in government. Overwhelmingly, the vast majority of women that work in the public sector, most of the people who work in public sector are women. This is why when the pandemic came around, all those jobs disappeared because they're not needed. They're welfare jobs. This is the other reason why you have corporate welfare, where the government says, well, you need to hire X amount of Latinos, you need X amount of women, you need X amount of trannies and X amount of gays, etc. Because at the end of the day, the corporations are beholden to the government and to the bankers that run the country. And so it's this entire dynamic of economically of what's going on in the country that people are just not taking into consideration. And so if you're a young man, there's absolutely no reason to participate in the dating market in the United States. It's even if you're a man who has goals of being wealthy, you have a business, you have assets, you own homes, maybe you rent those homes, you have a business, you run Airbnbs, etc. All you do is open yourself up to liability. So there is zero reason to date a woman in the States, especially in the West, entirely, because this whole scenario runs through. Europe has the exact same problem. Their trade deficit is growing. This is why you see them talking about the whole thing with oil and we need to save the planet, and it's all nonsense because it overwhelmingly revolves around other countries are starting to grow and they're growing economically and they're starting to produce. And so they say, we realize you kind of need us more than we need you Because if push comes to shove, maybe we'll just do trades in our own currency, which is what you're seeing happening right now. Other countries are doing trades in their own currency or in the yuan, which is what's happening between China and Saudi Arabia. And so it will cause inflation in the US because then if just look at the trade deficit, right? The trade deficit is $1 trillion. And so it's important to understand this dynamic. When will patriarchy return to the United States? When the United States is no longer the world reserve currency. This is why men go overseas and they're like, wow, the women are so fit and they're friendly. They're so agreeable. They're so very feminine to deal with. And it's like night and day when you go from this is why it's the same thing when you go through Europe. The Western European women act the same way as American women. And of course, American women are worse because the dollar is the world reserve currency. So the way women and men are is a reflection of what is going on economically. And if you don't take this into consideration, along with why the courts are the way they are, to incentivize to women to break up with women and to steal as much money as they can from the man through child support and alimony, etc. It's all related to economics. And so if you're a man who has, the ability to earn money, there is zero reason to date Western women. And so they're going to gaslight you. They're going to tell you you're lonely. They're going to tell you you can't get a woman. They're going to say all this type of shit. But it's really the women. It's really the women who can't get men. Because men understand, especially if you're a man who is worth his salt, you understand, as they say, the juice is not worth the squeeze. And so men just stop participating because all along the way, men have adapted as much as they can to the point where just men say, it ain't worth participating at all. And so this has economic issues because as a man, if you don't have a family, you don't need to buy a home, realistically speaking, you can be less productive. This is why the border is open. Because the men who are coming from abroad more than likely have families wherever they're coming from. And so those men who are typically poorer, they have a need to send money back to their families. And so that's why the border is open. That's why they bring those people into the country. Because realistically speaking, they have priced out the American woman from the economy, and along with that, the American man. There's no reason. I mean, realistically speaking, as a single man, I'm single, I'm 44 years old. I earn a high living. There's no reason for me to. I can literally get a cheap apartment somewhere in the country, and I can work enough within the span of 3 months to cover all the needs that I have as an individual. Because I don't have a family, I don't have kids to support, and I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. That's overwhelmingly where the cost and where the drive for excellence for men comes from. And this is the problem. And it can be solved through an economic collapse or through a civil war. But for most men, putting your life on the line for an American woman is not worth it. Especially if you run the risk. Most people will just be like, I just won't participate. I'll just stop dating. Or you'll be like some men who are like, maybe pass bro is an option. Maybe it's time for me to get my passport and to go overseas. Eventually, the government will have to do something to crack down as this scenario continues to get worse. Right now, the way that they're solving it is through immigration. That's why overwhelmingly all these people coming into the country are men, because they need men to work, to produce, so that the trade deficit doesn't get out of hand. And this is why the interest rates are going higher, and this is why they do everything possible to try to demonize men. The goal is to try to bring men back to the table so that they can basically throw you and push you through the meat grinder. And men have realized it's not worth it, especially through social media. And so the only thing the government can do is become more authoritarian. The problem is, if men don't make the decision themselves, the government will make the decision for you, because the government will do everything to protect itself. And so when the economic collapse eventually happens, it will not happen as a result of an external situation. America and most empires collapse from within. And the same will be for the United States. Whenever it does happen, the government will seek to preserve itself. Just look at Venezuela, Cuba, etc. Whatever country it is, the people who are in power want to stay in power. They're not going to just say, "Oh, we fucked up," all right, you guys figure it out. No, they're going to seize the means of production. They're going to seize all the resources, and then they're going to become authoritarian, and that will happen as well in America. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be this way, but the problem is that it results in men willing to spill blood and put their blood on the line. And currently, there isn't enough pain that men are experiencing because there's still enough freedom where men can economically move and either don't date, move to the country, go to another country, right? This is why passport, this is why they demonize passport. They say, "Oh, you're dusty. We don't want you anyway. Oh, you're just going to find poor women over there who are not economically attractive. You're just looking to go over there where they don't even speak English. They're uneducated. They do everything that they can to try to demonize you." Eventually, what they would do is they'll just make it very difficult for men to leave the country. Make it harder to get a passport, make it more expensive, so that less economically attractive men leave the country. This will happen without fail. It happened in France, and it's happened in every single country. The reality is, when things get bad, the people who can move. Just look at California. California is a perfect example. You still have people that live there, and like, why are you still there? If things are so bad, it's because they can't afford to leave. And the people who can, do. And the people who can't, suffer. It's the same thing for whatever city. Just look at New York. People are like, "Why are you still in a major city? Why are you still there?" Because they have to be there. They don't have a choice. But the economically attractive men who can leave, do leave. And they go towards where they find more freedom and more opportunity. The same will be true for those who are going overseas. It's not cheap to go overseas. A lot of men don't even leave the country. A lot of men are even afraid to leave their own town, let alone their own state, and let alone their country. But this is the reality. If the women really didn't care about you leaving, they wouldn't even bother talking about any of this stuff. But because you have men who are able to afford to move overseas and find a way to create wealth for themselves, this is what the women fear. And it will only continue to get worse because the only solution is collapse economically or civil war. And we're not at a point where people have felt enough pain, where the men haven't felt enough pain, where they say, fuck it, the only option is to go to war. The only option is war, because the other option is death and starvation. That's when you'll see men willing to put their lives on the line. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.